For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ali Bedad. I'm the director of the Center for Near Eastern Studies here at UCLA. And on behalf of my colleagues at the center, I would like to welcome you to the second, actually this is the third Averroës lecture. It was supposed to be the first, but this is the third now this year. Before I introduce our speaker and say a few words about the series itself, I would like to take this opportunity to thank a few people, especially Sarah Stein, the director of the Levy Center for Jewish Studies, for their co-sponsorship and support of these lecture series. As well, I would like to thank my colleagues at CNS, especially Omar Boom and Asli Bali, for their sort of intellectual leadership in bringing people here, in organizing really the series with Sarah. I also want to give a shout out to Joanna in the back and Christian, who help us with organizing doing the logistics of these series. Those of you who are not familiar with the Center for Near Eastern Studies at UCLA, CNES is a research hub where over 100 faculty from humanities, social sciences, arts, and the law school collaborate in a variety of research and pedagogical projects. Founded in 1957, it is one of the oldest and most distinguished U.S. centers for interdisciplinary research on the Middle East, broadly construed. We provide a forum for the exchange of ideas and the dissemination of information within and beyond campus, offering cutting-edge research and fresh perspectives on the challenges and cultural richness of the Middle East. We also support graduate and undergraduate instruction over a dozen academic departments, give numerous fellowships. We support research by faculty, students, and other scholars. Today's lecture, or today's talk, is part of our Averroës Lecture Series that has been underwritten by a generous anonymous donor, and which focuses on the Jewish communities living in Muslim lands prior to the 20th century. We have named the series Averroës. Actually, the founder of this, as I mentioned, is my colleague Asli Bali. And we called it Averroës, the Latin name, as you know, of Ibn Rushd, the 12th century Andalusian philosopher and polymath, whose work integrated Islamic traditions with ancient Greek thoughts to point to the rich history of Cordoba's Jewish-Muslim relation as a model of coexistence that unfortunately in some ways lacking today, as well as the connections between people like Averroës and the Jewish philosopher Maimonides, both of whom were committed to intellectual exchange and communal life across religious boundaries. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Oren Kosansky, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Lewis and Clark University, where he is the founding director of the program in Middle Eastern and North African Studies. Professor Kosansky, who also directs the Rabat Genizah Project, which brings together an international theme of community representatives, scholars, activists, and information technologies to develop a digital archive of Moroccan Jewish documents. Professor Kosansky's research focuses on the Jewish community in Morocco, the historical community, and he has written on a wide range of issues pertaining to this minority community, including the Jewish question in post-colonial Moroccan cinema, Judeo-Muslim pilgrimages, questions of hybridity, and the idea of the Moroccan nation, and the dialectology and differences in colonial Morocco, especially Jews who spoke Arabic, just like as in the Andalusia. His work has appeared in some of the most prestigious venues in his field, including the International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, Cultural Anthropology, and Comparative Studies in Society and History. Professor Kosansky is also the co-editor of an important volume, Jewish Studies at the Crossroads of Anthropology and History, Authority, Diaspora, and Tradition, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania in 2011. His talk today is titled Mahia on the Market on the History of Moroccan Jewish Community. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the Center for Near Eastern Studies and the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. As we all know, I think since we're here, the coordinated work of these centers has been critical for sustaining research and training upcoming scholars who work at the intersection of these two areas. And I'm particularly grateful for the warm welcome that's been extended to me as someone who comes from the more provincial West Coast, a little bit north of here. And I've always been really grateful for the warm welcome and the place that people have made for me here. I'm especially honored to be speaking in the Averroës Lecture Series. And the theme of Muslim-Jewish relations is, to be sure, appropriate to my topic today, though the focus is decidedly more contemporary and, one might say, less philosophical. So, a few years back, I found myself purchasing a bottle of Mejia, this is it, at a liquor store not far from the Royal Mausoleum in Morocco's capital city of Rabat. Mejia is a brandy which translates from the Arabic as water of life and is often distilled from dried figs and flavored with anise, as I was just speaking with here. I'll pause here, and I want to also thank those from the community who came today to be with us and to hear what I have to say. I know that the work of the center is directed both at academic causes like myself, but the broader community. So thank you all. And as always, when I speak and folks from Morocco show up, I look forward to learning more as well, particularly in the discussion period. Mejia is known among Moroccans as a traditional concoction associated with the country's Jewish population. As a longtime ethnographer within that social milieu, I had ample acquaintance with Mejia, as it had been produced by Jewish artisans, circulated through Jewish networks, used in Jewish liturgical and pilgrimage rituals, celebrated in Jewish poetry, documented in colonial ethnography, called up in Jewish memoirs, commemorated in Jewish museums, and so forth. Mejia is deeply inscribed in Jewish memory and the documentation of Jewish life. Although cash often changes hands at some point in the customary economy of Mejia, as I had come to know it, the context of its social life bore all the hallmarks of classically imagined gift exchange in my field of anthropology, distilling numerous categories of Jewish social and cultural life. Against this backdrop, that is the backdrop, an ethnographic backdrop of seeing Mejia in people's homes in the context that we were speaking about earlier, I was almost giddy that night when unmistakably I overheard a Muslim customer request a bottle, which swiftly appeared on the counter. Until that point, I was unaware that Mejia was manufactured as an industrial commodity and marketed to a broader, more anonymous Moroccan consumer public. Seizing the moment, I did what any self-respecting ethnographer would do. I asked for a bottle. The object lesson proceeded as the clerk responded with his own terse query, one that voiced familiar retail categories when referring likewise to bottles of Coca-Cola or mineral water. Kabira or saghira, big or small? He said. Finding the shop carried 5 different brands of Mejia, I brought one, they were small, of each. The investment was minimal. I would learn that the general popularity of industrial Mejia of the kind on offer was due in part to its unbeatably low price. As a matter of calculation towards the objective of inebriation, for this is what Muslim consumption of commercial Mejia is stereotypically associated with today, this was actually a rational choice. At the same time, Mejia manufacturers adopted a strategy far from unique to the Moroccan context of branding their product in terms that evoked qualities and histories that might attract the sympathies of consumers for whom, in this case, the Jewish associations of the beverage would vouch for its authenticity. among other signs, and you can see them here. Many of the bottles had Hebrew on them. It says tafraut on the bottom. As well, if you turn it around, you don't have it in the picture, but kosher. It says that it's kosher, and in Hebrew script as well. The relationship I had provisionally dubbed communal Mejia, the relationship between what I had provisionally dubbed communal Mejia and commercial Mejia, the former an artisanal brew made in homes and workshops that I found circulating through an informal economy restricted ideally to Jewish consumption, and the latter, an industrial product I only knew to be consumed by Muslims, was more complicated still. My initial assumption that mass-produced Mejia was a recent phenomenon proved unwarranted. Up until that time, I had never seen a bottle of Mejia produced from a factory. Ethnographic and archival probing disclosed what people in this audience know, a longer history of industrialization and its associated modes of commercialization extending back through the colonial period, which ran formally from 1912 to 1956. By the time of my own 21st century encounter, the interplay between what's sometimes called homemade Mejia, Mejia de Dar, as it's sometimes called in Arabic, and its factory-made variant could not be understood simply in sequential terms. It had been the prolonged coexistence of Mejia and its dual forms, neither one extinguishing the other, that it has determined the full significance of both. Added to this, a third kind of Mejia has become prominent in public consciousness over the past several decades. This might be called criminal Mejia. And it circulates in a black market economy populated by non-Jewish producers and consumers, and has been brought into national prominence in magazine articles, television coverage, newspaper editorials, blogs, and so forth in Morocco, and in French and in Arabic language. This kind of Mejia conjoins the worst connotations of communal and commercial Mejia, subverting any of their salutary potentials. If, for example, the Jewishness of Mejia can be made to represent the convivial interfaith intimacies of a pluralistic national past, the Averroës theme, that includes all Moroccans, the same ethnic valence can stand for the moral marginality of a Jewish population in a Muslim context. Mejia, that is easily figured as a public danger, prohibited by Islamic law and gateway to the proliferation of other vices and sins. The availability of factory Mejia on the market in no way skirts these criticisms. And indeed, the idiom of the market itself, self-interested, materialistic, cutthroat, grounds the critique of black market criminal Mejia as an emblem of soulless capitalism, where profits trump consideration of religious, ethnic, or social consequences. In these ways, the criminal variant brings into focus a more general feature. The moral resonances of Mejia are, to say the least, multiple and contradictory, ranging on the one hand from extremely positive to the other hand extremely negative. These are the swirling observations that incite the question that motivate the larger project, of which my comments today are a small part. We'll only get to, as always, a little piece of the puzzle. And that question is, what kind of commodity did Mejia become when it was reconstituted as the object of new modes of industrial production, state regulation, national imagination, and market commercialization? And conversely, how can tracing the emergence of Mejia on the market help us to better understand those few modes of production, regulation, imagination, and commercialization? What I want to share with you today is a brief account of only certain phases in the recent history of Mejia commodification against the backdrop of the other two modes, which I actually won't talk about that much here. One being the continuing modes of communal Mejia, that is to say, artisanal production in the house. There's a whole ethnography there, and I'll allude to it, but won't get into it here. And then on the other hand, as a step towards considering this phenomenon of what I'm calling criminal Mejia, which I won't talk about that much either as well, though both of those I'll allude to and we'll hear a little bit about. But mostly what I want to trace is just a little bit about this history of industrial commercialization of Mejia as I've come to learn about it. The transformation of Mejia into the kind of commodity that would end up in a 21st century liquor store, as I found it, reflected the broader ways in which the French colonial project reconfigured Morocco more generally. Edmund Burke III's suggestion that the French protectorate operated as an ethnographic state points productively towards the intertwined processes by which Mejia became an object of colonial ethnography and state regulation about the same time, and the ways in which those are actually part of the same process, making Jewish Morocco and Mejia more generally into an object of representation for certain purposes related to the protectorate, and then making into an object of new forms of state regulation as the colonial administrative apparatus was set up. Even prior to the institution of the protectorate in 1912, Mejia appears regularly in European ethnographic literature. Like many symbols in the colonial ethnographic repertoire, this one was used in opposing ways and towards contradictory ends. On the one hand, Mejia and wine consumption seemed to distinguish Jews from Muslims, and thus provided further evidence of North African social heterogeneity that would be exploited in colonial strategies that sought to emphasize and exploit the antagonism between the constituents of what was taken to be traditional Moroccan society. The proposition that Jews were oppressed within Islamic society, the anti-Averroës thesis, I guess, relegated in urban contexts to residential quarters known as mellas and subjugated to humiliating restrictions as non-Muslim legal subjects, dhimmis, provided part of the pretense by which Jews could be imagined as natural allies of imperial projects, which cloaked themselves as liberal and emancipatory forces. Mejia, as we'll see, was not necessarily the most salutary form of Jewish distinctiveness in Morocco, as understood in French ethnography, but the beverage could nevertheless be included in the much broader array of features that distinguished Moroccan Jews from Muslims. The cultural geography of Mejia was likewise marked in distinctively Jewish terms. In urban contexts, the Mella, the Jewish quarter, appeared as the quintessential locus of Mejia production. And in rural contexts, where it was also recognized that Mejia was produced, Jewish saint shrines were cast as one of the most characteristic sites of the beverage's consumption. Both of them marked really clearly in Jewish ways. At the same time, Mejia seemed to represent Moroccan society more generally as a backward civilization ripe for European intervention. The relevant ethnography attended comprehensively to the consumption, circulation, and production of Mejia, whose intoxicating properties, interfaith distribution, and traditional manufacture were elaborated as signature features. Even as Jews themselves continued to be identified as the primary social actors associated with Mejia, both the people and the product came to stand for Morocco writ large as a place that remained isolated in a languishing medieval past that invited moral reform and required social straightening. Drunkenness, especially amongst Jews, but also amongst Muslims, was seen as a problem endemic to life in the Mella, where alcohol abuse seemed to indicate the constitutional intemperance of the Jews. And this is how one late 19th century commentator put it. The Mella is poisoned by alcohol. Even women and children drink Mejia. Sometimes poor devils come to the school begging for a glass of alcohol as if for a piece of bread. I saw a baby at its mother's breast swallow a spoonful of eau de vie, Mejia, water of life, that she laughingly forced upon him. The baby was already emaciated and marked by consumption. Kids between 10 and 15 years old make bets as to who can drink the most in the least amount of time. The flow of alcohol is tremendous. The point, just to be clear, is not to weigh in on the ethnographic accuracy of these comments as a representation of what was going on. Although the Mella was defined primarily in Jewish terms, this did not prevent colonial commentators from pointing out that Muslims also frequented Jewish quarters precisely for the purpose of acquiring and consuming alcohol. Muslim consumption of Mejia was all the more damning since it represented the double liabilities of both drunkenness itself and the inability to adhere to one's own religious prohibitions. Muslims were implicated in the consumption of Mejia in more indirect ways as well. The Islamic oppression of Jews was often cast as one context that made Jewish use of the intoxicant as a palliative inevitable. As such, the ostensible prevalence of Mejia served not only as an indictment of its Jewish users, but also of their Muslim overlords responsible for creating the conditions that made drunken escape necessary. Much was also made of the native use of Mejia as a therapeutic libation and elixir that, like the snake oil of a charlatan, prevented the local population from seeking scientific medical treatment. Mejia, that is, stood for the entire complex of magical practices and superstitious beliefs that were held to subvue Moroccan society more generally. The fact that Mejia circulated for such purposes amongst both Muslims and Jews only reinforced its capacity to stand for a more universal Moroccan mentalité. Many of these themes, drunkenness, excess disorder, heterodoxy, superstition, overlapped with colonial representations of another cultural institution with which the drink was associated. These events, known as hilulot, hilula is a singular, typically entail pilgrimages to often rural shrines where devotees gather to celebrate and petition sainted rabbis buried therein. And this is how one colonial ethnographer described the scene at a pilgrimage site, and you'll see the resemblance to the first. It's difficult to render an account of the kind of frenzy that one sees in this time of major pilgrimage, and with their Bacchic disorder and heavy drinking. Do these gestures attest to the woeful inability to appeal to God except with carnal exaltation? A drunkard quivers while performing a grotesque dance in the synagogue attached to the cemetery. The master of ceremonies, wearing a white robe and pointed hat of a carnival barker, auctions the favors of the saint. Passers-by urinate and vomit by the wall without separating themselves from the crowd. Half the people that press against me are drunk. The smell of the bleeding meat resting against the tent poles, the door of filth, and the distilled liquor, Mejia, dominate. This is what I saw at the Hilula of Dra. I feel compelled again, actually, to say that as I read them, they really are dramatic, aren't they? That a big body of my work, just to be clear, is aimed at giving a very different view of what goes on at these pilgrimages in a way that, to say the least, is more sympathetic. Scenarios like this one indicate several of the connections that in colonial discourse pertain between Mejia and Hilulot. The two cultural phenomenon appear to be functional equivalents, each in its own way serving as a means to cope, however counterproductively, with the travails of Jewish life in Morocco. As compared with the numbing effects of drunkenness, the belief in the intercessory power of saints held the hollow promise of a better future. Together, Mejia and pilgrimages were each viewed as signs of social disorder, carnal excess, and filth. And the point of sort of going through that again is to create a stage in which when the Moroccan, the protectorate, the French protectorate, instituted a set of laws to regulate the production and consumption of Mejia, it did so with two backdrops. One was the one that I just suggested, which is to say a view that everything in Morocco needed regulation, and that Mejia was a particularly extreme example of what that was. There's another piece which I won't get into here, and I won't be talking that much about the regulations themselves, so I'm developing that elsewhere, is that many of those laws, in fact, drew on a different history, which was related to the fact that it was in the 20th century that the regimes of alcohol production and economy in Morocco were also being regulated in a similar way. And drunkenness in France was also seen in a similar light. And so what we see in Morocco with this regulation is in many ways like other facets of the Moroccan legislation under the protectorate, is this interesting hybrid between French cosmopolitan laws related to alcohol and this attempt to map that onto a Moroccan environment. Now, Mejia was the object of more than representations under the colonial regime, as I just suggested. Like many other aspects of Jewish life in the Mellah, Mejia became the object of new forms of administrative regulation enforced by the colonial state. Mejia had previously been taxed within Jewish communities, whose relative autonomy in such matters was a facet of their status as dhimmi subjects. Such arrangements became newly codified under colonial law as relatively informal and decentralized forms of taxation were entered into national legislation. A more radical shift occurred as alcohol production in general and Mahia production in particular came to be regulated at a national level, with the domestic manufacture of liquor, as well as actually the importation of liquor, being legally curtailed by restrictions on the private ownership of stills. From the start, the relevant regulations were unevenly implemented and often contradictory, leaving local communities and producers to navigate the legal terrain as best they could. None of these developments, that is, would entirely halt the production of artisanal Mejia, Mejia de Dar, and so forth. Indeed, one of the contradictions of colonial legislation was that it allowed only handcrafted Mejia to be used for ritual purposes, while also drastically restricting the artisanal production of the beverage in an effort to shift the industry into an industrial industry. It's a common pattern in colonial contexts. It was no secret within Jewish communities that clandestine Mejia production continued, both to meet religious requirements and because the quality and the taste of the home brew was deemed to be superior, and that continues to be the case. That is that view, and in my view, that I will weigh in here. I will say it's true. Mejia, therefore, emerged as an early site of resistance to the regulatory apparatus of the colonial state as Jewish producers negotiated the shifting boundaries of their previous autonomy. At the same time, imported liquors from Europe increasingly penetrated the market. Indeed, one colonial commentator noted that whiskey was fast outstripping Mejia as the alcohol of choice in some communities. And just to point out, that's something that I even witnessed in the course of my research in Morocco. And just to give one example, at these hilulot, where Mejia is still used for ritual purposes, which we won't get into, whiskey also has a very prominent role. It was in this legal and commercial context that the industrial production of Mejia within Morocco began on a small scale by Jewish entrepreneurs. Jewish consumers, who remained numerous enough to constitute a significant market, were positioned as the commodity's target, though never exclusive public. And this industrialization of Mejia is exemplified by one particular brand, which I want to talk about a little bit. We were talking, again, we had a side conversation earlier here, so about some of the brands of Mejia that people remember having encountered in Morocco. The brand that I want to talk about is this one here. You can't really see it here, but it's Mejia by a company called Taurel. And this I was able to find is a notice of the constitution of the company in 1929, and its registration in the appropriate administrative units of the French Protectorate. I'm working a little bit on trying to figure out the history of this company, which as I'm finding in this period in 19 Taurel is one that certainly has the strongest traces in the documentary record. As we'll see, they have advertisements in Jewish magazines and so forth. And then, as I'll mention later, as I've been trying to track some of the ways in which Mejia is remembered nostalgically, particularly among Jews in the Moroccan diaspora, this is the one that is showing up most. It seems the families of Algerian origin, and that they opened up outfits in Algeria and in France, and only later came to Morocco. And the company actually had a large portion of the market of both the domestic production of alcohol, but also imports of things including whiskey. Mejia Taurel represents what might be called the high modern moment of Mejia's commercialization, a successful effort to sustain the communal aura of the beverage within Jewish domains in the context of new legal and industrial regimes. So this is an ad from La Voix de Communauté. Now it's at the end of this period, 1961. And as you can see, it's the first item appeared in L'Avenir Illustré, a Jewish magazine. This is another Jewish magazine in which Mejia, the advertisement appeared. And it appears, and I've been able to track advertisements in several contexts. The success of Mejia Taurel, as I've said, is attested to both by the longevity of the enterprise and the subsequent nostalgia for the project that's carried over into what our colleague here, Omar, has called the virtual Genizah, the different online forums in which Moroccan Jews get together to remember nostalgically life in Morocco. So I want to talk about this Mejia Taurel for a bit in this image and what's going on here. One of the challenges that the project is trying to address is the ways in which, there's a shift in this period to industrial Mejia, although there continues always to be this, what I'm calling communal Mejia, being produced. That is how these industries attract and retain a Jewish clientele for whom the move to industrialization might be alienating, might represent something less authentic. As we can see in this image, Mejia Taurel foreshadows some of the visual elements, including the use of Hebrew. And then it says in French, La Reine de Mejia, the Queen of Mejias, and we'll see that item as well. I just realized now, as I was calling this the high modern moment, something I haven't realized before, but this image itself in some ways resonates with what we think of as modern art, and certainly modern advertising, modern illustration. And it was these elements that would later be taken up as well as a visual sign of authenticity in marketing Mejia to a predominantly non-Jewish clientele. That is my own encounter later on. During this earlier period, when Judeo-Arabic was still an active language within a substantial Jewish community, the Hebrew script was also used in more extensive marketing, and I want to spend some time talking about that. So this is a pamphlet that I came across. It was collected by Paul Dahan, who has, as some of you know, has a really outstanding collection in Belgium of materials. I know it's hard to read the words, so we'll go over some of them. If you can try to make it out, that's great. If not, we'll go over some of them together. And so this is produced, I'll just go back to this page to give you a sense. This is from Mejia Taurel. It's La Reine de Mejia, you can see here, and we'll come back to this page in a moment. But this is where the story starts. So I wanted to start with the story, and I want to just go through the story a little bit to go through some of the elements that situate Mejia Taurel in the authenticating spaces of what potential clients, that is to say Jews, would likely take to be traditional Jewish life. Again, this is clearly written for a Jewish audience. It's in Judeo-Arabic and in French. The setting is the Mellah. You can see that clearly by the architecture. Whose exterior streets are populated by jalaba-garbed old men, and whose interiors, and you can see obviously the two main characters have jalabas on. In the fifth pane, you see there's an old man squatting in the corner. It's all these emblems of Jewish life. And then in the house, actually, you even get some reference to this other domain that I was speaking about, which is that of saints and pilgrimage. In the sixth frame here, this is clearly an icon of a saint in this context. The two men are sporting these stereotypical traditional Jewish garbs when they meet on the street. One, I'm just going over the story quickly, you can try to track it visually. One appears to be barely middle-aged, the other is white-haired, balding, wrinkled, and hunched over. The difference between them, they learn in later frames, is not due to their respective ages, they're roughly the same, but to the fact that the younger-looking man is on a regime of Mejia Taurel. And it's in the final side that we see, it's this bottom one here, you see the old man running, that one sip of Mejia is all it takes for the older-looking man to straighten up, reject his cane, and sprint spryly down the street. And this is something already to keep in mind, it's really already quite a stark contrast to colonial ethnography. Right, where this is celebrating the recuperative healing properties of Mejia. To call this an extension of of what I spoke about earlier as a rejection of that whole narrative is something that we can talk about. What's especially interesting about this modern narrative is how it mediates the challenge of rendering industrialized Mejia as an authentic legacy from the traditional past, while also addressing a modern clientele for whom the full range of Mejia superstitions might be alienating. That strategy can be observed by looking more closely at the Judeo-Arabic and French renditions of the dialogue. So I just want to go through some of those. They're here. I couldn't quite get it so that we could track back and forth between the Judeo-Arabic and so forth, but I'll add some to what we're going on here. So let's just go through one. This is Judeo-Arabic. Mordechai, the young man, says, "Come to my house with me and I'll show you," this is Judeo-Arabic, "and I'll show you the medicine that I drink to stay young and full of energy." And the word here that's used for medicine is dua, which is a word for medicine. And it's used both in a modern sense. If one goes to a pharmacy, one buys dua, although they are more likely to use a French word. But the word dua has very, very strong resonances in two other contexts. One is in the saint pilgrimage context, in which the language of pilgrimage is a language of healing and the language of medicine. That's really quite clear. And the other is an associated one in which Jews for a very long time to the present were considered to be very powerful, to use a hackneyed English word, shamans, people, magicians, and folks who would create herbalists who would create medicine for that would work both in physical and spiritual ways. So that's a French. This team dua. If you notice in the French version, and so this version of a medicine, again, as I'm saying, is really in stark contrast to the French colonial ethnographies, which would have seen this whole complex of practices as being antithetical to anything called medicine. In the French, that's erased. There's no reference to medicine. There's no effort to claim that Mejia operates as dua. And all we have here is come home and I'll explain it to you. It kind of reminds me sometimes when you're watching a movie and you have the subtitles and there's this long discourse that ends up being reduced to a very short sentence, and you know you've missed something. So the next one here, Mordechai speaking to his wife, Mazal, look, I've brought Samuel with me. Sorry about that mistake. Give him a taste of that medicine that has kept me young and full of energy. And then the other one, Mardochée, Mazel tov, I bring you Samuel the aged. Explain to him the secret of my youth. Again, erased. And then finally, Mazel tov, here it is. Drink and see the wonder of our master. And the wonder of our master, we'll look at that one in Derija in a moment, to get a sense of the way in which the marketers are really playing on Mejia really as sustaining this medicinal, I'll call it spiritual, magical element, which is erased in the French. And here the marketers can balance between those audience. That is a modernist audience that might find the Judeo-Arabic less inviting. But if you look back here, so there's we have in the green frame there, in French, le secret de la jeunesse, the secret of youth, and that is carried over in the language, but the Arabic is l'azib de moulana, the wonder of our master. And this language of l'azib de moulana, again, is really drawn from this broader language of, we'll call it traditional healing, saints and pilgrimage, and so forth. What both versions retain, however, is a fully Jewish frame, a visual and linguistic, fully Jewish frame of visual and linguistic references that addresses a distinctively Jewish market. That again is trying to navigate this particular moment of this transition to an industrial Mejia and its implications. Okay, I want to finish up by talking a little bit about the post-colonial transformation of Moroccan Mejia industry, which coincided with national independence and the era of mass Jewish migration, processes that reduced the Jewish buying public and constrained how Jewish products circulated publicly. Industrial Mejia production has remained in Jewish hands, But for palpable demographic reasons, the market has shifted to an almost exclusively Muslim clientele. While certain motifs have remained from branding strategies established by companies like Mejia Taurel, new ones have emerged as well. So we'll go back here. This is that first slide. Hebrew letters, as I mentioned, for example, continue to be a key feature of the label. Even though it's reasonable to assume that most buyers can't make out the words, and again, even if this label might have been originally designed in an era where its users might have been Jewish, that's not the case anymore. The words are still markers that rely on the authenticating of effect of a recognizable Semitic script in an environment where Mejia production remains closely associated with the Jewish community. So I want to talk a little bit about what Jewishness of Mejia then suggests for Muslim consumers. And in many ways, the meanings in play are similar to those we've already considered. The story isn't entirely different. Jewish labeling invokes the cultural milieu that once vouched for the product's authenticity. Labels that exploit Hebrew-style orthography and Jewish symbols create the fiction of small batch craftsmanship rooted in an authentic Moroccan past. The significance of this frame is appreciated even more fully when we consider that contemporary Muslim consumers also recognize that Jews once dominated in a wide range of crafts, silverwork, just to give an example, that define artisanal Morocco more generally. The consumption of Mejia among Muslims can also reflect a pattern of attitudes towards Jewish foods more generally, with Mejia being only one of several Jewish delicacies that Muslims stereotypically desire. And among the most famous of these dishes is schina, or dafina, a slow-cooked Shabbat stew, which Muslims are said to love, both for its taste and for the good fortune it's supposed to provide. And I've witnessed both, by the way. I've been in more than one Moroccan home on a Sabbath eating schina, and a Muslim neighbor has come and knocked on the door. It's represented in movies, and you see it in all these contexts, and it continues today. The idea that food is a vehicle of ingestible blessings is elaborated in numerous Muslim contexts, pilgrimages included. So, for example, it's not uncommon on pilgrimage to bring in Arabic it would be use to cause to make pilgrimage foods, bringing foods to the pilgrimage site, Mejia in particular, resting it on the shrine, and then bringing it home with the blessings of the saint. Partly this is, in the Muslim context, and in the Jewish context as well, partly this is because Jews have long been, as I've mentioned, closely associated with certain kinds of magical powers. There remains in Morocco, for example, popular interest in potions, infusions, amulets, and such produced by Jewish magicians and herbalists. As an elixir produced by Jews, Mejia can serve a similar function, and its association with magical powers appears not to be lost on those who have marketed it as a commodity. The graphics that adorn another brand of Mejia include, as we've seen, here's this one, Yad al-Fatima, Hand of Fatima, which is a well-known amulet image in Morocco. We also saw this, I didn't point it out, but in the Mejia Taurel advertisements as well. I am now, interestingly, not done, but at the end of my notes, because I think that the printer didn't print out the rest, but fortunately I'm almost done. So we'll take a look at these last slides together, and that's fine in the convivial spirit that Mejia is supposed to support. And I want to talk about one last set of emerging associations in the industrial production of Mejia that I found less in the colonial period and find more now, and that is what I'll call for now the Amazigh or Berber elements of marketing, which we didn't see at all, for example, in Mejia Taurel. It was entirely set in the Medla. The images were urban images. Increasingly, we have a whole set of labels and marketing strategies that refer to the Berber aspects, the Amazigh aspects of Mejia production. So here's one, Tafraut, the famous one, is, as some of you know, this toponym, a name of a place, Tafraut, beginning with a T, ending in T, would resonate with most Moroccans as representing a Berber area, a rural Berber area. Ourika as well. And here's one, Tawirt, Tawirt, thank you, which we've spoken about before. And then I'm just back from Morocco, and I always go to stores and see what's in stock. And so this is a really interesting one that I just bought 2 weeks ago, Beb Gnawa. And so we have this image, which is so starkly one of a particular rural, semi-Berber kind of context, though we still have the Hebrew, right? The Hebrew doesn't go away here. And so I'll just conclude by speaking a little bit about some initial reflections on this emergence of this. And it's not this revitalization. It's not that the Berberness of Mejia was ever absent, but the ways in which it's been taken up in the labeling. The first point is that the Berber element in no way displaces the Jewishness, and in fact could reinforce it. So it's not as though they're necessarily in competition with each other. The idea of there's a figure of the Berber Jew is well known. The notion and what Jews and Berbers share, which is actually integral to Mejia itself, is a sense that they represent, in conjunction with each other, pre-Islamic, pre-Arab Morocco. That is, a Morocco in which certain views of alcohol might have been more liberal, let's say. So the first point is that they're not necessarily in contrast with each other, and they can reinforce each other. Likewise, that reinforcement points much more towards the rural domain than the urban. So what Mejia Taurel did is emphasize the Mella as the location of Mejia production and consumption. And I think there's been a shift to emphasizing the rural. And I'm still starting to sort of work that out because I'm just starting to notice this pattern. There are at least two things going on. One is, over the past several decades, Mellas themselves have been become much more associated with the criminalization of Mejia for a variety of reasons. So the Mella is no longer necessarily where a marketer might want to go to create an aura, a traditional aura of Mejia. So that's one. The other, of course, is that the rural areas now have, particularly as Morocco, as elsewhere, becomes more urbanized, itself lends a certain a naturalness, a certain authentic aura. And so here, for example, the corollary, if I spoke about the idiom of Mejia de Dar, Mejia that was made in the house, there's also this idiom of Mejia de Bled, of the countryside. So that was always there as a possible authenticating move. The fact that it's being taken up now is really interesting. And I think there might be a couple of things going on here. And it might point towards an effort to really be thinking creatively about who's buying Mejia for what purposes. And I'll add here as well, just as an aside, that there are only one or two companies who are doing this now for this kind of market. There's some other markets which I can talk about as I conclude. But they've been really creative and very, very prolific in creating different labels. Same company, multiple labels. Now that's a common marketing strategy in global capitalism, differentiated marketing, figuring out. But they've really experimented with some, for example, that have nothing to do with Jewishness or Berbers. So there was one, for example, that had an American flag on it. And that no longer, I think the idea here is the question is there any longer a need to authenticate in that particular way? Or has the market for this kind of Mejia shifted in such a way that the purchasers are not as interested in this authenticating move? Insofar as they might be, this emphasis of Berber in conjunction with Jewish might suggest that a recognition that for younger generations of drinkers, one, there might be less familiarity with the Jewish context, and there might be more ambivalence for what it might mean for contemporary Morocco and the future of Morocco. The other things to work out a little bit more. So this is the final phase that I want to speak about, is this, let's call it this Berberization of Mejia. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention and look forward to extending the discussion and hopefully learning from some of you as well. Thank you.